Hey guys, tonight we tumble headfirst into one of history's most intimate legal battles, where medieval bedchambers became courtrooms and marriage contracts spelled out duties that would make your modern divorce lawyer blush. You're about to discover how the Catholic Church, feudal lords, and village gossips conspired to transform knightly intimacy into a measurable debt, complete with ledgers, fines, and ecclesiastical enforcement that reached right under the covers. Imagine waking up in 1347 to discover that refusing your spouse's advances could land you in front of a bishop's court faster than you could say, "Not tonight, dear." You probably won't survive this revelation without questioning everything you thought you knew about romantic love versus legal obligation. If you're into this kind of soft-spoken time travel, tap like and hit subscribe. It's free, and you're never stuck with it. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and how your evening's going, whether you're in Tokyo at sunrise or somewhere in the American Midwest counting sheep. Now settle back, let your breathing slow, and prepare to slip into a world where passion met paperwork in the most unexpected ways. You stand in the stone-walled archives of Canterbury Cathedral, where dust motes dance through colored glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across ancient manuscripts that chronicle centuries of human desire, regulated by divine authority. The air carries the weight of 800 years, thick with the scent of parchment aged to the color of honey, leather bindings worn smooth by countless scholarly fingers, and the faint trace of incense that has seeped into every stone through decades of continuous worship. Your fingers trace along leather-bound volumes that chronicle not just births and deaths, but the intricate dance between desire and duty that they governed medieval marriages with clockmaker precision. These weren't love letters or poetry collections gathering romantic dust. They were legal manuals that spelled out conjugal obligations with the meticulous attention to detail that modern tax codes reserve for corporate deductions. The concept you're encountering tonight emerged from a collision between Roman law, Christian theology, and practical politics that created what canonists called debitum conjugale, the conjugal debt. Picture this legal principle as a spiritual accounting system where husbands and wives maintained running tallies of physical intimacy, tracked with the same meticulous attention medieval merchants gave to grain shipments or wool exports. The church taught that marriage created mutual obligations so binding that refusing your spouse's reasonable request constituted theft, literally stealing what rightfully belonged to your partner under sacred contract. St. Paul's letters provided the theological foundation, particularly his instruction that the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over her own body, but the wife does. Medieval canonists interpreted this reciprocal arrangement as creating legally enforceable duties, though they quickly developed elaborate rules about when, where, and how frequently these obligations must be fulfilled. The daily requirement wasn't universal, but it represented the ideal standard promoted by influential theologians who believed regular intimacy prevented adultery, ensured legitimate heirs, and maintained household harmony. As you turn these brittle pages, you realize that medieval legal scholars approached marital intimacy with the same systematic thinking they applied to property disputes or inheritance claims. Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively about proper frequency and circumstances, arguing that refusing conjugal rights without just cause constituted mortal sin. His Summa Theologica dedicated entire sections to parsing the moral implications of marital intimacy, creating theological frameworks that canonist lawyers used to build comprehensive legal systems governing bedroom behavior across Christian Europe. Canon lawyers developed intricate classification systems distinguishing between reasonable requests and excessive demands, creating what amounted to the world's first sexual harassment guidelines wrapped in Latin terminology and biblical citations. They established categories for legitimate refusal: illness, recent childbirth, religious feast days requiring abstinence, or what they termed unreasonable frequency that might endanger health or spiritual well-being. The enforcement mechanisms you're uncovering reveal how thoroughly the medieval church monitored private life. Bishops' courts regularly heard cases involving conjugal refusal, with punishments ranging from public penance to temporary separation. Court records document hundreds of cases where spouses sued for restitution of conjugal rights, using language that sounds oddly modern despite being written in medieval Latin. One fascinating English case from 1342 involved a merchant's wife who successfully argued that her husband's demands exceeded reasonable bounds, establishing precedent for appropriate frequency while protecting women from excessive demands. You notice how these legal requirements intersected with medieval medicine's understanding of human sexuality. Physicians believed that regular intimacy balanced the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, promoting fertility while preventing various ailments caused by sexual frustration. Medical treatises recommended specific frequencies based on age, season, and astrological calculations, creating elaborate prescription schedules that resembled modern medical protocols. This medical backing gave legal force to what might otherwise seem purely religious doctrine, as courts could cite health concerns when ordering reluctant spouses to fulfill their obligations. A wife suffering from what medieval physicians diagnosed as uterine fury, caused by insufficient intimate attention, could petition church courts for medical intervention that required her husband to increase conjugal frequency. The daily standard emerged from monastic timetables that structured medieval life around canonical hours, just as monks gathered for lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, nones at mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before sleep. Married couples were encouraged to maintain regular physical connection as part of their spiritual discipline. This wasn't casual suggestion, but systematic religious practice that integrated intimate obligations into the broader rhythm of Christian devotion. Remember that bizarre medieval contraception involving crocodile dung and honey that physicians prescribed? Well, medieval doctors also recommended daily intimacy as natural birth control, believing that frequent coupling without conception would eventually exhaust the woman's fertile capacity. Medical advice that was spectacularly wrong, but legally influential since it provided scientific justification for ecclesiastical mandates about conjugal frequency. Regional variations show how differently various kingdoms interpreted these obligations. French courts typically required formal complaints and witness testimony before intervening in marital disputes, while English ecclesiastical law allowed for swifter enforcement based on simple accusations. Italian city-states developed the most elaborate procedural safeguards, perhaps reflecting their sophisticated legal traditions inherited from Roman jurisprudence. German regions often delegated enforcement to local priests rather than formal courts, creating more informal but equally intrusive oversight. The economic implications reveal how conjugal debt intersected with property law and inheritance rights. Failure to fulfill conjugal obligations could void marriage contracts, dissolve property settlements, and trigger inheritance disputes that affected entire kinship networks. These weren't simply personal relationships, but economic partnerships where intimate performance carried financial consequences that rippled through generations of carefully negotiated family arrangements. Historians still argue whether the daily requirement represented genuine religious conviction or patriarchal control disguised as spiritual duty. Some scholars emphasize how these laws protected wives from abandonment by ensuring husbands couldn't simply ignore their marital responsibilities, while others highlight how the same regulations could be weaponized to force unwanted intimacy. The truth likely varies by time, place, and individual circumstances, but the legal framework clearly treated marital sexuality as too important for private discretion. You sense the profound irony that an era we often romanticize for its courtly love poetry and chivalric ideals actually regulated intimate relationships with bureaucratic precision that would impress modern family courts. These weren't passionate lovers stealing kisses in moonlit gardens. They were legal parties bound by contracts specifying their physical obligations with the clarity of merchant agreements. The medieval church, despite its reputation for sexual repression, actually mandated regular marital intimacy as religious duty, creating one of history's most intrusive forms of state-sponsored sexuality. As you close this first volume, candlelight flickering across the final pages, you begin to understand how thoroughly medieval society believed that private behavior required public regulation. The conjugal debt wasn't just about individual marriages, It was about maintaining social order, ensuring legitimate succession, and preventing the sins that unmarried or sexually frustrated people might commit. Tomorrow you'll discover how church courts actually enforce these intimate obligations, but tonight you drift towards sleep knowing that medieval bedchambers were never truly private spaces. You glide through the stone corridors of Winchester Cathedral, where robed bishops gather in hushed councils, their whispered debates about marital obligations echoing off vaulted ceilings that soar toward heaven like frozen prayers. The air carries the scent of beeswax candles, mixed with aged parchment and the faint metallic tang of ceremonial incense, while these ecclesiastical authorities wrestle with calendars that would make your modern scheduling apps seem quaint by comparison. These aren't planning vacation days or dinner parties. They're calculating the precise frequency of conjugal duties based on feast days, fasting periods, lunar cycles, and theological principles that governed medieval Christian life with astronomical precision. The church courts you're observing operated as intimate tribunals, where private bedroom disputes became public ecclesiastical business, transforming the most personal aspects of married life into legal proceedings that could determine eternal salvation or damnation. Picture these proceedings as medieval marriage counseling sessions with legal teeth sharp enough to excommunicate, where bishops serve simultaneously as judges, spiritual advisors, sexual arbitrators, and moral authorities whose decisions affected not just individual couples, but entire communities watching to see how ecclesiastical law would resolve intimate conflicts. You discover that the ecclesiastical calendar created a complex rhythm of permitted and prohibited times for marital intimacy that resembled a theological traffic light system governing bedroom behavior throughout the Christian year. Advent brought mandatory abstinence as couples prepared spiritually for Christ's birth, requiring weeks of celibacy that tested both religious devotion and marital harmony. Lent imposed even stricter prohibitions that could last 40 days, creating what theologians called spiritual purification through intimate denial, that supposedly prepared souls for Easter's resurrection celebration. Various saints' days scattered additional prohibitions throughout the calendar, like theological landmines. Saint Agnes required abstinence on January 21st, while Saint Lucy demanded celibacy on December 13th, creating what canonists called the holy pause in conjugal obligations that could stretch for weeks when multiple religious observances clustered together during particularly dense liturgical seasons. Yet outside these sacred seasons, the Church actively encouraged daily fulfillment of marital duties with the same fervor it promoted regular prayer and charitable works. Bishops developed elaborate scheduling systems that resembled modern fertility tracking applications, but designed to maximize rather than prevent conjugal frequency for spiritual, medical, and social reasons that intertwined individual salvation with community welfare. As you eavesdrop on these clerical discussions, their Latin phrases mingling with vernacular explanations for less educated parish priests, you realize how thoroughly church authorities monitored the intimate lives of their parishioners through surveillance networks that penetrated every household in medieval Christendom. Parish priests were instructed to inquire about conjugal habits during confession, transforming the sacrament of penance into intelligence gathering that created spiritual databases of intimate compliance and failure. These conversations weren't casual pastoral inquiries, but systematic data collection that informed ecclesiastical decisions about individual couples and broader community moral health. Priests asked specific questions about frequency, timing, and mutual satisfaction that would make modern marriage counselors blush, recording answers in mental notes that shaped their understanding of which marriages required intervention and which provided positive examples for struggling couples. The enforcement mechanisms you're witnessing operated through a sophisticated combination of shame, spiritual coercion, and legal sanctions that leveraged the total religious environment of medieval society, where church membership determined social existence. Bishops could order public penance for conjugal refusal, requiring offending spouses to stand barefoot outside church doors, wearing distinctive penitential garments, while entire congregations filed past for Sunday services, their disapproving stares serving as community-based punishment that isolated offenders from normal social interaction. More serious cases resulted in temporary excommunication that effectively cut offenders off from all social and economic relationships in deeply religious communities, where church membership provided the only legitimate path to participation in medieval civilization. Excommunicated individuals couldn't conduct business, marry their children, receive medical care from Christian physicians, purchase food from markets controlled by religious guilds, or even receive last rites that ensured salvation after death. You observe how these ecclesiastical courts developed surprisingly sophisticated procedures for investigating intimate complaints that would challenge modern privacy advocates. Witnesses were called to testify about sleeping arrangements, nocturnal sounds, morning dispositions, and physical evidence that might indicate conjugal compliance or refusal. Neighbors provided testimony about sounds heard through thin walls, while servants reported observations about bed sheet conditions, nighttime movements, and morning behaviors that suggested intimate activity or its suspicious absence. The medieval church created what amounted to neighborhood watch programs focused exclusively on bedroom behavior, transforming entire communities into intimate surveillance networks where private relationships became public business subject to collective oversight and institutional judgment. Children testified about their parents' sleeping arrangements, while elderly relatives provided historical context about family patterns of conjugal compliance that established precedents for current expectations. The daily standard you're exploring emerged directly from monastic traditions that structured religious life around regular spiritual exercises performed at fixed intervals throughout each 24-hour cycle. Just as monks gathered for prime at dawn, terce at mid-morning, sext at noon, nones in mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before sleep, married couples were encouraged to maintain consistent physical connection as part of their spiritual discipline. Church authorities argued that irregular intimacy led to spiritual imbalance comparable to missed prayers or abandoned fasting obligations that disrupted the soul's proper relationship with divine order. They developed theological frameworks explaining how conjugal debt functioned as spiritual discipline that strengthened marriages while preventing the moral corruption that resulted from unregulated sexual desires. Medical advice reinforced ecclesiastical mandates through physicians who served both church and secular authorities, creating scientific justification for what were essentially religious requirements. These learned men prescribed daily intimacy as treatment for various ailments, ranging from female melancholy and uterine disorders to male anger, violence, and the dangerous humoral imbalances that threaten both individual health and community stability. Court physicians regularly testified in conjugal cases, providing medical evidence about the health consequences of sexual abstinence that supported ecclesiastical enforcement of marital obligations. They maintained that sexual abstinence caused dangerous accumulation of bodily humors that could lead to madness, violence, or spiritual corruption, requiring immediate conjugal intervention. Regional ecclesiastical differences created a fascinating patchwork of conjugal regulations across medieval Europe. French bishops typically required more extensive documentation before intervening in marital disputes, perhaps reflecting sophisticated administrative traditions that emphasize procedural safeguards. English church courts moved more swiftly, based on simpler accusations, while Italian ecclesiastical authorities developed the most elaborate appeal processes, reflecting their proximity to papal oversight and sophisticated canon law traditions. You witness fascinating cases where wives successfully used ecclesiastical courts to enforce their own conjugal rights against reluctant husbands, revealing how the conjugal debt operated as a two-way obligation that could protect women's interests within patriarchal legal systems. Medieval church law explicitly recognized women's entitlement to regular intimacy, creating legal recourse for wives whose husbands neglected their marital duties through travel, illness, or simple disinterest. Historians still argue whether ecclesiastical enforcement of conjugal debt represented genuine pastoral care or institutional control over the most private aspects of human relationships. Some scholars emphasize how church intervention protected vulnerable spouses and maintained family stability, while others highlight how the same system enabled spiritual coercion in intimate relationships. As you drift away from these candlelit ecclesiastical councils, the murmur of clerical voices debating conjugal calendars fades into peaceful silence. You begin to understand how thoroughly medieval Christianity viewed marriage as a public institution requiring institutional oversight rather than a private relationship governed by individual preference. Tomorrow you'll discover how ordinary peasant couples navigated these ecclesiastical requirements in their humble cottages. But tonight you rest knowing that medieval bedrooms were never beyond the reach of episcopal authority. You find yourself padding barefoot across mud-spattered cobblestones in a village where thatched cottages huddle together like sleeping animals seeking warmth, their windows glowing amber against the evening darkness while smoke curls from chimneys into the star-scattered sky. The air carries the rich scent of wood smoke mingling with fresh bread cooling on windowsills, the earthy aroma of gardens where cabbages and turnips grow in neat rows, and the unmistakable smell of animals, chickens scratching in dooryard dirt, pigs snuffling in their pens, and cattle settling for the night in ramshackle barns that lean against cottage walls like tired friends. Here in these humble dwellings, far from episcopal courts and theological debates conducted in university Latin, medieval marriage debt played out in whispered conversations and careful tallies that ordinary people maintained with the same meticulous attention they gave to counting eggs or measuring grain for winter storage. These weren't learned canonists parsing theological subtleties, but practical folk who understood that conjugal obligations carried real consequences in communities where church authority reached into every cottage and priestly oversight governed behavior from cradle to grave. You peer through diamond-paned windows into single-room cottages where entire families shared living space barely larger than your modern bathroom. Yet even here, the church's conjugal requirements shaped intimate relationships with surprising precision that adapted theological principles to practical constraints of rural poverty. In these cramped quarters where privacy was a luxury that existed only in darkness and hushed tones, peasant couples developed elaborate systems of silent communication that conveyed intimate intentions without disturbing sleeping children, elderly relatives, or temporary guests who shared their tiny homes. A touch on the shoulder while banking the evening fire might signal readiness for conjugal compliance, while strategic positioning of clothing on wooden pegs could indicate availability or temporary indisposition. The way a wife arranged her spinning wheel or positioned her husband's work tools served as intimate vocabulary, understood by couples who lived their entire lives within arm's reach of parents, children, and extended family members whose presence required constant discretion in managing marital obligations. The daily requirement you're witnessing adapted to agricultural rhythms that governed peasant life, with seasonal precision that would challenge modern scheduling applications. During planting and harvest seasons, when daylight hours stretched from dawn to dusk, and physical labor demanded every ounce of strength, exhausted couples might negotiate modified arrangements that balanced ecclesiastical expectations with the physical reality of subsistence agriculture, where survival depended on maximizing productive labor during brief agricultural windows. Imagine trying to maintain daily intimate obligations after 14 hours of backbreaking fieldwork, when your body aches from dawn to dusk labor that included plowing rocky soil with primitive tools, harvesting grain by hand with sickles, or threshing wheat with flails that left muscles screaming and joints swollen. Yet village communities maintained social pressure that ensured conjugal duties continued even during the most physically demanding agricultural periods, when couples could barely remain conscious after collapsing onto straw mattresses. You discover how peasant women used conjugal debt as leverage within marriages, where they possessed little formal power but significant influence over intimate negotiations that could affect household management and resource allocation. A wife might strategically withhold compliance to protest her husband's drinking that consumed precious resources needed for family survival, gambling losses that threatened their economic security, or failure to maintain their cottage roof before winter rains that could destroy stored grain. These weren't dramatic courtroom confrontations, but subtle domestic negotiations, where conjugal obligations became bargaining chips in ongoing marital discussions about household priorities, children's welfare, and family resources that required careful management to survive the constant economic pressures of peasant life. A wife's temporary conjugal refusal might motivate her husband to complete necessary repairs, moderate his drinking, or prioritize family needs over personal pleasures. Village gossip networks you're observing operated as informal enforcement mechanisms that rivaled any ecclesiastical court for intimate surveillance, creating social pressure systems that encouraged conjugal compliance without requiring formal church intervention. Neighbors whose cottages shared walls inevitably knew which couples fulfilled their obligations and which experienced difficulties that might require community intervention or priestly oversight. The village laundress who collected weekly washing knew whose bed sheets required frequent cleaning that suggested regular intimate activity, while the local midwife tracked which families welcomed new arrivals with predictable regularity that indicated consistent conjugal compliance. The parish priest who conducted monthly confessions gathered intelligence about intimate patterns that informed his pastoral care and potential intervention in marriages that failed to meet ecclesiastical standards. This community knowledge created sophisticated social pressure that encouraged conjugal compliance through mechanisms more subtle but equally effective than formal ecclesiastical punishment. Couples who neglected their intimate obligations might find themselves excluded from cooperative work arrangements essential for agricultural survival, passed over for favorable trade opportunities, or subtly ostracized from social gatherings that provided crucial community support during economic hardships. The economic dimensions of conjugal debt among peasants reveal how intimacy intersected with survival strategies in subsistence agricultural communities where household dissolution could mean literal starvation during harsh winters or crop failures. Regular marital relations were viewed as insurance against household dissolution, ensuring that both spouses remained committed to shared economic enterprises that required coordinated labor throughout the agricultural year. A husband who neglected conjugal duties risked his wife's departure to her family of origin, potentially losing crucial female labor for textile production, food preservation, and childcare that allowed him to focus on agricultural work. Similarly, a wife's conjugal refusal might prompt her husband to seek intimate satisfaction elsewhere, potentially abandoning household responsibilities that left her economically vulnerable in societies where single women possess few survival options. You witness fascinating examples of peasant creativity in adapting conjugal requirements to practical constraints of rural life. Couples developed seasonal agreements that increased intimate frequency during winter months when agricultural demands decreased, and couples spent more time indoors together, then reduced expectations during spring planting and autumn harvest, when physical exhaustion made daily compliance unrealistic while still maintaining enough intimate contact to satisfy ecclesiastical oversight. These informal arrangements required no ecclesiastical approval, but demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to balance religious obligations with agricultural necessity, while maintaining the social harmony that kept village communities functioning despite constant economic pressures. Couples might agree to concentrate intimate activity during specific periods that aligned with agricultural calendars, ecclesiastical seasons, and personal health considerations. Medical folk wisdom reinforced ecclesiastical teachings through village healers who prescribed regular intimacy as treatment for various common ailments that plagued peasant communities lacking access to trained physicians. The local wise woman might recommend increased conjugal frequency to treat female melancholy or irregular menstruation, while village healers suggested daily fulfillment as preventive medicine against male anger and violence that could disrupt community harmony. Remember that humoral theory we discussed earlier? Peasant communities developed practical applications that used intimate obligations as healthcare interventions long before formal medical training reached rural areas where folk wisdom provided the only available treatment for health problems that could disable crucial household labor or threaten family survival. Regional variations among peasant communities show how local customs modified universal church teachings about conjugal debt to accommodate different agricultural systems and cultural traditions. English villagers typically maintained more formal accounting of intimate obligations, perhaps reflecting stronger ecclesiastical oversight in regions with well-established parish systems. French peasants developed more flexible seasonal arrangements that accommodated their agricultural calendar's specific demands, while German rural communities often integrated conjugal compliance with other household duties, creating comprehensive systems of marital obligation. You observe how peasant couples navigated the tension between church teachings and practical reality through creative interpretations that satisfied spiritual requirements while acknowledging physical limitations imposed by agricultural labor and simple exhaustion. A couple might fulfill daily obligations through intimate contact that stopped short of full relations during periods of illness or extreme fatigue, or maintain regular schedules during certain seasons while accepting reduced frequency during others. These adaptations demonstrated how ordinary people negotiated between institutional expectations and lived experience in ways that preserved both religious compliance and practical survival. Peasant couples developed informal solutions that balanced competing demands without requiring formal ecclesiastical consultation that might bring unwanted institutional attention to arrangements that worked effectively for rural communities. Historians still argue whether peasant compliance with conjugal debt represented genuine religious devotion or practical submission to unavoidable social pressure. Some evidence suggests that rural communities genuinely embraced church teachings about marital intimacy as spiritual discipline, while other records indicate that compliance was motivated primarily by fear of social ostracism or ecclesiastical punishment that could destroy families through excommunication or loss of community support. As you step away from these glowing cottage windows where the sounds of rural evening, roosters settling, cattle lowing, children's sleepy voices fade into peaceful silence, you begin to understand how conjugal debt functioned as lived experience among ordinary medieval people who adapted ecclesiastical requirements to the practical constraints of agricultural life while maintaining the religious compliance that kept their communities within the protective embrace of church authority. Tomorrow you'll discover how these intimate obligations played out in aristocratic castles where political stakes transformed bedroom behavior into dynastic strategy. But tonight, you rest knowing that medieval marriage was never simply a private matter between two people, but a complex intersection of religious obligation, economic necessity, and community oversight. You ascend spiraling stone staircases into castle towers where silk tapestries muffle the whispered intrigues of noble marriages, and the scent of rosewater mingles with burning cedar logs in massive fireplaces that could swallow peasant cottages whole. Here in these palatial chambers lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose own intimate obligations shaped the bloodlines that legitimized current noble claims, conjugal debt transforms from peasant necessity into aristocratic strategy, where bedroom obligations intersect with territorial claims, inheritance disputes, and diplomatic alliances that could reshape entire kingdoms. The daily requirement you've been exploring takes on entirely new dimensions when failure to fulfill marital duties might trigger succession crises or provide enemies with grounds for annulment that could dissolve decades of careful political maneuvering. These weren't simply romantic relationships governed by personal affection or physical attraction. They were dynastic contracts where conjugal compliance ensured legitimate heirs, prevented inheritance disputes, and maintained the political stability that kept noble houses in power across generations of European warfare and diplomatic intrigue. Castle bedchambers became diplomatic venues, where intimate performance carried consequences that rippled through networks of feudal obligation, international treaties, and succession laws that determined which families would control vast territories, command military forces, and influence royal policy. A duchess's conjugal refusal might destabilize alliances between kingdoms, while a duke's intimate neglect could provide legal grounds for his wife's family to reclaim dowry lands that included strategic fortresses, profitable trade routes, or agricultural estates that generated the wealth necessary to maintain political power. The elaborate protocols you're witnessing reveal how noble couples navigated conjugal obligations within households staffed by dozens of servants who monitored every aspect of aristocratic behavior with the attention to detail that modern security services reserve for protecting heads of state. Ladies-in-waiting tracked their mistresses' monthly cycles with astronomical precision, noting variations that might indicate pregnancy, illness, or the stress that could affect fertility, and succession planning that determined dynastic survival. Male attendants observed when lords retired to private chambers and emerged the following morning, recording subtle behavioral cues that suggested intimate compliance, or the marital discord that might require intervention by family advisors, court physicians, or ecclesiastical authorities who specialized in resolving aristocratic conjugal disputes. Castle staff maintained informal intelligence networks that documented intimate compliance with the same systematic attention they gave to diplomatic correspondence, military preparations, or the complex ceremonial requirements that governed noble life. You discover how aristocratic women wielded conjugal debt as political leverage within marriages that functioned as international treaties between noble houses whose interests extended across multiple kingdoms. A duchess might strategically withhold intimate compliance to protest her husband's military alliance with her family's hereditary enemies, using bedroom behavior as diplomatic communication that conveyed political messages more effectively than formal negotiations between competing noble factions. These weren't emotional decisions based on personal preference or romantic disappointment. They were calculated political maneuvers, where bedroom behavior became diplomatic strategy, requiring careful timing, sophisticated understanding of dynastic implications, and precise knowledge of how intimate leverage could influence military campaigns, territorial negotiations, or succession planning that affected the balance of power across medieval Europe. The medical advisors you're observing brought university training to aristocratic households where conjugal health carried political significance that demanded professional management by physicians who understood both human reproduction and dynastic necessity. Court physicians prescribed elaborate intimate schedules based on astrological calculations, humoral theory, and seasonal considerations that maximized fertility while maintaining proper noble decorum and the ceremonial requirements that distinguished aristocratic marriage from common peasant unions. These learned men created detailed treatment plans that resembled modern reproductive medicine, but focused on ensuring dynastically significant conception through scientifically optimized conjugal compliance that served political purposes beyond personal satisfaction. They prescribed specific foods, wines, herbs, and even musical performances designed to enhance intimate appeal and reproductive success within the broader context of noble marriage, as political institution rather than personal relationship. Regional noble customs created fascinating variations in how aristocratic households managed conjugal obligations within the broader context of European diplomatic relationships that connected royal courts across national boundaries. French court culture emphasized elaborate ritual and ceremony around intimate duties, with formal presentations and witness retirements that documented conjugal compliance for potential legal proceedings that might determine inheritance claims or marriage validity in future succession disputes. English noble houses developed more private systems that balanced conjugal requirements with concerns about political surveillance by the rival factions seeking ammunition for inheritance disputes or marriage annulments that could redistribute power among competing aristocratic families. These systems reflected England's unique position between continental European politics and insular traditions that required careful balance between international diplomatic requirements and domestic political stability. You witness how castle architecture reflected the political importance of conjugal compliance through elaborate private suites designed to facilitate intimate obligations while maintaining appropriate noble dignity that distinguished aristocratic behavior from common pleasantry. Master bedchambers featured separate antechambers where couples could prepare for conjugal duties according to medical and religious requirements that ensured both spiritual compliance and optimal conditions for conception that might produce the heirs necessary for dynastic survival. Hidden passages allowed discreet movement that prevented servants from documenting intimate schedules that enemies might use against the noble house in legal proceedings or political negotiations where marriage validity, heir legitimacy, or conjugal compliance could become weapons in broader struggles for territorial control, royal favor, or succession rights that determined which families would control European political power. The seasonal diplomatic calendar you're discovering shows how aristocratic conjugal obligations adapted to the rhythm of medieval political life that revolved around military campaigns, court gatherings, and international negotiations. Tournament seasons brought increased intimate requirements as noble couples sought to conceive heirs before husbands departed for potentially fatal competitions that combined military training with political networking among aristocratic families whose alliances determined European balance of power. Similarly, campaign seasons created compressed intimate schedules designed to maximize conception before military obligations separated noble couples for months of dangerous warfare that might leave duchies without legitimate succession, creating inheritance disputes that could trigger conflicts between kingdoms, competing for control over strategic territories, profitable trade routes, or military resources necessary for medieval political survival. Economic considerations among the nobility reveal how conjugal debt intersected with vast financial resources that could be deployed to ensure compliance with ecclesiastical requirements while maintaining the luxury standards that distinguish noble lifestyle from common existence. Noble houses employed private chaplains who provided theological guidance about intimate obligations, while court physicians offered medical treatments designed to enhance conjugal performance and fertility through professional interventions that peasant couples could never afford. These weren't peasant couples managing intimate duties alongside agricultural labor that consumed every moment of daily existence. They were aristocratic households where conjugal success required professional support teams, significant financial investment, and sophisticated coordination between medical advisors, spiritual counselors, and political strategists who understood how bedroom behavior affected diplomatic relationships that shaped European political development. You observe fascinating musses where noble conjugal disputes became international diplomatic incidents that required papal intervention and royal mediation to resolve conflicts that threatened alliance systems carefully constructed through generations of aristocratic marriage negotiations. One memorable English case from 1389 involved a duke whose conjugal refusal sparked inheritance claims from his wife's French relatives, ultimately requiring diplomatic negotiations that reached the highest levels of both kingdoms and influenced military alliances that affected European warfare for decades. The perfume and luxury goods you're encountering reveal how noble households invested heavily in enhancing conjugal appeal as political necessity rather than personal vanity. Imported spices, exotic cosmetics, and elaborate silk garments weren't simply aristocratic indulgence. They were diplomatic tools designed to maintain intimate relationships that secured political alliances and dynastic stability through conjugal compliance that ensured legitimate succession and prevented the inheritance disputes that could destroy noble houses. Castle inventories document surprising expenditures on items designed to ensure conjugal compliance among couples whose intimate success determined the fate of entire noble houses, their military retainers, dependent peasant communities, and the complex networks of feudal obligation that connected aristocratic families across European political boundaries. These investments reflected the political stakes involved in noble marriage, where bedroom behavior carried consequences that extended far beyond individual relationships to affect international diplomacy and European balance of power. Historians still argue whether aristocratic conjugal obligations represented genuine political strategy or elaborate rationalization for personal behavior that reflected medieval nobility's broader tendency to transform private decisions into public spectacles that demonstrated their elevated status above common social constraints. Some scholars emphasize how conjugal compliance served legitimate dynastic functions in societies where political stability depended on clear succession lines that prevented civil wars between competing claimants to noble titles and territorial control. You sense the profound irony that an era famous for courtly love poetry and romantic idealization actually subordinated aristocratic intimate relationships to political calculation with ruthless precision that would impress modern diplomatic services. These weren't passionate lovers pursuing romantic fulfillment through personal choice and mutual attraction. They were political operatives whose bedroom behavior carried consequences that could trigger wars, dissolve alliances, or determine which noble houses survived into the next generation through successful navigation of European political competition. As candlelight flickers across silk bed hangings, and the last servants retreat from noble chambers where tomorrow's political decisions might depend on tonight's intimate compliance, you begin to understand how thoroughly aristocratic conjugal debt integrated intimate relationships into the broader political machinery of medieval Europe, where personal behavior served dynastic necessity rather than individual satisfaction. Tomorrow you'll discover how church scribes documented these intimate obligations through official records that could determine legal proceedings, but tonight you rest knowing that medieval noble marriage was never about perso. You drift into the candlelit scriptorium of Cluny Abbey, where monks bent over writing desks labor through the night, their quills scratching across parchment as they document the intimate obligations that govern Christian marriage with the same meticulous precision they apply to copying biblical texts and recording monastic accounts. The air fills with the scent of oak gall ink, powdered pigments for illuminated margins, and the ever-present smell of sheep parchment that transforms living animals into permanent records of human behavior regulated by divine authority. Here among the scrolls and codices that preserve a medieval civilization's written memory, you discover how church scribes transformed conjugal debt from theological principle into bureaucratic reality through official documentation that could determine legal proceedings, inheritance disputes, and marriage validity across generations of European political development. These weren't casual record-keeping exercises, but systematic documentation projects that created comprehensive archives of intimate compliance and failure that shaped individual destinies and dynastic survival. You peer over the shoulder of Brother Anselm as his steady hand records testimony from ecclesiastical court proceedings, where conjugal disputes receive the same formal documentation accorded to property transfers, criminal prosecutions, or the complex feudal agreements that govern medieval political relationships. His careful Latin phrases transform bedroom behavior into legal language that strips away personal emotion, individual preference, and romantic sentiment in favor of precise terminology that reduces intimate relationships to measurable obligations subject to institutional oversight. The marginalia you're noticing reveals the human side of these supposedly objective legal records, where scribes occasionally allowed personal opinions to creep into official documents through subtle flourishes, decorative elements, or coded references that modern historians struggle to interpret. A carefully drawn flower beside a particularly salacious testimony about conjugal frequency might indicate the scribe's embarrassment, while elaborate border decorations around cases involving noble marriages could reflect the political importance of properly documenting aristocratic intimate behavior. Remember that crocodile dung contraception we mentioned earlier? Well, medieval scribes also documented the medical prescriptions that physicians provided to enhance conjugal performance, creating pharmaceutical records that reveal surprising sophistication in medieval approaches to sexual health. These medical marginalia include recipes for aphrodisiac potions, fertility-enhancing herbs, and treatments for the various ailments that supposedly resulted from inadequate conjugal compliance, combining folk wisdom with classical medical theory inherited from Greek and Roman sources. The filing systems you're observing demonstrate how thoroughly medieval bureaucracy organized intimate information for easy retrieval during legal proceedings that might occur years or decades after initial documentation. Scribes developed elaborate indexing methods that cross-reference conjugal cases by geographic location, social status, specific allegations, and legal outcomes that created searchable databases of intimate behavior that would impress modern information management professionals. These archives weren't simply historical curiosities, but active legal resources that ecclesiastical courts consulted when resolving new conjugal disputes, establishing precedents for appropriate intimate frequency, or determining punishments for couples who failed to meet their marital obligations. A scribe might search through decades of accumulated records to find similar cases that could guide current judicial decisions about what constituted reasonable conjugal expectations versus excessive demands that exceeded legitimate marital rights. You discover how scribes used coded language to discuss intimate matters that required official documentation but challenged medieval sensibilities about appropriate public discourse regarding sexual behavior. They developed elaborate euphemisms, biblical metaphors, and classical references that allowed precise legal communication about bedroom obligations while maintaining the dignity that ecclesiastical documents required when discussing subjects that might otherwise seem inappropriate for religious institutions. The illuminated manuscripts you're examining reveal artistic traditions that decorated conjugal documentation with imagery that reinforced church teachings about marital intimacy as spiritual discipline rather than physical pleasure. Margin decorations featuring intertwined vines, flowering branches, or geometric patterns that suggested fertility and growth provided visual context that emphasized the procreative purposes of conjugal obligations while avoiding explicit imagery that might distract from the legal content. Regional scribal traditions created fascinating variations in how different monasteries and cathedral schools documented conjugal cases, reflecting local theological emphases, political relationships with secular authorities, and cultural attitudes toward the appropriate level of detail required for legal proceedings involving intimate behavior. French scriptoriums typically maintained more elaborate ceremonial language that emphasized the dignity of marriage as sacrament, while English scribes developed more practical terminology that focused on enforcement mechanisms and punishment procedures. Italian scriptoriums, influenced by classical Roman legal traditions in proximity to papal authority, created the most sophisticated documentation systems that included detailed cross-references, appeals procedures, and precedent citations that transformed conjugal law into comprehensive jurisprudential frameworks. German monastic schools often integrated scriptural quotations more extensively into their conjugal records, creating documents that function simultaneously as legal proceedings and theological instruction about proper Christian marriage. The copying networks you're witnessing reveal how the conjugal documentation spread across medieval Europe through monastic correspondence that shared legal precedents, enforcement techniques, and theological interpretations among ecclesiastical authorities who needed consistent approaches to regulating intimate behavior across different kingdoms and cultural regions. Scribes maintained regular correspondence with colleagues in distant monasteries, exchanging copies of particularly significant conjugal cases that might influence legal development across Christian Europe. These networks created standardization in conjugal law that transcended political boundaries between competing kingdoms, establishing universal Christian principles about marital intimacy that applied equally to French peasants, English nobles, Italian merchants, and German craftsmen, despite their different languages, legal traditions, and cultural customs regarding appropriate intimate behavior within marriage relationships governed by ecclesiastical authority. You observe how scribes developed specialized abbreviation systems that allowed rapid documentation of repetitive conjugal terminology while maintaining legal precision that ensured accurate record keeping during extended court proceedings. These shorthand methods enabled efficient processing of large numbers of conjugal cases that flooded ecclesiastical courts during peak enforcement periods when church authorities launched comprehensive campaigns to ensure community-wide compliance with marital obligations. The preservation techniques you're discovering show how seriously medieval institutions treated conjugal documentation as permanent legal records requiring professional archival methods that would ensure accessibility for future generations of ecclesiastical judges and canonical lawyers. Scribes used high-quality parchment, fade-resistant inks, and protective storage methods that preserved intimate legal records with the same care they devoted to preserving biblical manuscripts, theological treatises, or the diplomatic correspondence that governed international relationships between Christian kingdoms. Historians still argue whether the extensive documentation of conjugal behavior represented genuine legal necessity or institutional voyeurism that reflected clergy's unhealthy obsession with lay people's intimate relationships. Some scholars emphasize how systematic record-keeping protected both accusers and accused by ensuring fair legal proceedings based on documented evidence, rather than gossip or personal animosity that might motivate false allegations of conjugal neglect. Others highlight how the same documentation systems enabled institutional intrusion into private relationships that transformed bedroom behavior into public business subject to professional oversight by celibate clergy who possessed theoretical knowledge about marriage obligations but lacked personal experience with the practical challenges of maintaining intimate relationships within the economic and social constraints that governed medieval married life. The intersection of conjugal documentation with broader medieval literacy reveals how church control over written communication enabled ecclesiastical authorities to shape public understanding of marriage obligations through official records that defined appropriate intimate behavior according to institutional rather than personal standards. These documents didn't simply record existing social practices but actively created new expectations about conjugal frequency, technique, and spiritual significance that transformed medieval marriage from traditional social arrangement into religiously regulated institution. You sense how thoroughly conjugal documentation integrated intimate relationships into the broader bureaucratic machinery of medieval Christianity, where personal behavior became institutional business, requiring professional management by trained specialists who understood both canonical law and practical administration. These scribes weren't simply recording events, but actively shaping social reality through documentation practices that defined legitimate marriage, appropriate intimate behavior, and proper Christian lifestyle. As dawn light begins filtering through stained glass windows, while Brother Anselm continues his methodical documentation of last night's ecclesiastical court proceedings, you begin to understand how medieval society used written records to extend institutional control over the most private aspects of human experience. Tomorrow you'll discover how ordinary people experience the enforcement of these documented obligations, but tonight you rest knowing that medieval marriage existed as much on parchment as in private chambers. You step into the dimly lit chambers of a medieval physician's residence, where the walls are lined with ceramic jars containing exotic remedies. Dried herbs hang in aromatic bundles from wooden beams, and the air carries the mingled scents of frankincense, crushed rose petals, and the mysterious compounds that learned doctors prescribe to enhance conjugal performance according to the sophisticated medical theories that governed medieval approaches to sexual health and marital obligation. Here in these scholarly sanctuaries, where university-trained physicians merged classical knowledge with practical experience treating the intimate ailments of medieval society, you discover how medical authority reinforced ecclesiastical mandates about conjugal debt through scientific frameworks that transform bedroom behavior into therapeutic necessity, requiring professional intervention by learned doctors who understood both human anatomy and divine purpose. The medical texts you're examining reveal surprisingly sophisticated approaches to sexual health that combined Greek humoral theory with Roman anatomical knowledge and Christian theological principles to create comprehensive treatment protocols for the various conditions that supposedly resulted from inadequate conjugal compliance. These weren't folk remedies passed down through oral tradition, but systematic medical interventions documented in Latin treatises that circulated among university-educated physicians across medieval Europe. Dr. Bartholomæus of Salerno, whose weathered hands showed decades of preparing medicinal compounds, explains how the regular intimacy maintains proper balance among the four bodily humors that govern human health and temperament. He demonstrates the preparation of remedies designed to enhance masculine vigor, feminine receptivity, and mutual satisfaction that ensures both spiritual compliance with church teachings and optimal physical health according to medical principles inherited from ancient authorities whose wisdom shaped medieval scientific understanding. You observe how medieval physicians prescribe conjugal frequency with the same precision modern doctors use for pharmaceutical dosages, creating detailed treatment schedules that specified not just how often couples should fulfill their obligations, but precise timing based on lunar cycles, seasonal variations, and individual constitutional factors that required professional assessment by trained medical practitioners who understood the complex interactions between intimate behavior and bodily health. The honey-based tonics you're witnessing being prepared contain carefully measured quantities of exotic spices, ground pearls, and rare herbs that supposedly enhance intimate desire while promoting the fertility that ecclesiastical authorities viewed as marriage's primary purpose beyond simple physical satisfaction or emotional bonding between spouses. These expensive remedies weren't available to peasant couples, but reflected the significant financial investment that noble households made in ensuring conjugal success through professional medical support. Medical consultations you're observing reveal how physicians served as intimate counselors who provided detailed guidance about optimal conjugal technique, appropriate preparation rituals, and the various factors that could interfere with successful marital relations, according to classical medical theory that attributed sexual dysfunction to humoral imbalances requiring immediate therapeutic intervention by qualified practitioners. These consultations weren't brief exchanges, but comprehensive assessments that included physical examination, detailed questioning about intimate habits, and lifestyle recommendations that address diet, exercise, bathing practices, and seasonal adjustments designed to optimize conjugal performance according to medical principles that treated intimate behavior as measurable physiological function rather than private emotional expression between married couples. Remember that bizarre contraception involving crocodile dung? Well, medieval physicians also prescribed the opposite: fertility-enhancing treatments that included ground rhinoceros horn, powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, and various mineral compounds that supposedly increased conception rates when conjugal obligations were properly fulfilled, according to medical guidance that transformed bedroom behavior into scientific enterprise requiring professional oversight. The astrological calculations you're discovering show how medieval medicine integrated celestial observations with intimate prescriptions, creating treatment schedules that aligned conjugal obligations with planetary movements, lunar phases, and seasonal changes that supposedly influenced human fertility and sexual capacity, according to classical theories that connected earthly behavior with cosmic forces governing natural processes throughout the medieval understanding of universal order. Regional medical traditions created fascinating variations in how different schools approached conjugal health, reflecting local therapeutic customs, available ingredients, and cultural attitudes toward the appropriate role of professional medical intervention in intimate relationships. The famous medical school at Montpellier developed sophisticated protocols emphasizing herbal remedies and dietary modifications, while physicians trained in Padua focused more heavily on surgical interventions and anatomical considerations that required detailed physical examination. You witness how court physicians maintain detailed case records documenting their patients' conjugal health over extended periods, creating medical archives that tracked intimate performance, fertility outcomes, and treatment effectiveness across years of professional care that provided scientific evidence for medical theories about optimal conjugal frequency and technique, according to empirical observation rather than purely theoretical speculation. These medical records weren't simply clinical documentation, but legal evidence that could be cited in ecclesiastical court proceedings when couples disputed their conjugal obligations or sought professional testimony about reasonable expectations for intimate frequency based on individual health considerations that might modify standard religious requirements for daily compliance according to medical necessity rather than spiritual failure. The surgical procedures you're observing being performed address various conditions that medieval physicians believed interfered with proper conjugal performance, including procedures designed to enhance masculine capacity, correct female anatomical variations that supposedly prevented conception, and remove growths or other physical abnormalities that might impair intimate function according to medical understanding of human reproduction and sexual anatomy. Professional medical networks facilitated the exchange of conjugal health information among physicians across medieval Europe through correspondence that shared successful treatments, documented case studies, and theoretical developments that advanced medical understanding of human sexuality within the broader context of university scholarship, that treated intimate behavior as legitimate subject for scientific investigation and professional intervention. The pharmaceutical preparations you're witnessing being created include elaborate compounds that combine expensive imported ingredients with local herbs according to precise formulations that required extensive professional training to prepare correctly. These remedies represented significant financial investment that reflected the importance medieval society placed on ensuring conjugal success through professional medical support that complemented ecclesiastical oversight and social pressure. Historians still argue whether medieval medical intervention in conjugal health represented genuine scientific advancement or elaborate justification for intrusive professional oversight of intimate relationships that provided financial benefit to physicians who claimed expertise in matters that couples might otherwise handle privately without professional intervention, requiring expensive consultation and ongoing treatment protocols. Some scholars emphasize how medical approaches to conjugal health provided scientific foundation for ecclesiastical requirements while offering practical solutions for couples experiencing intimate difficulties that might otherwise threaten marriage stability and community harmony. Others highlight how medicalization of intimate behavior extended professional control over private relationships while creating new categories of sexual dysfunction that required expensive treatment by qualified practitioners. The intersection of medical theory with religious obligation reveals how medieval society integrated scientific and spiritual approaches to conjugal health through comprehensive systems that treated intimate behavior as simultaneously physiological function, requiring medical oversight and spiritual discipline, demanding ecclesiastical guidance from qualified authorities who understood both bodily mechanisms and divine purpose governing Christian marriage. You sense how thoroughly medical intervention transformed conjugal obligations from simple religious duties into complex therapeutic enterprises, requiring professional management by trained physicians who understood both classical medical theory and practical applications that optimized intimate performance according to scientific principles that supported ecclesiastical teachings while providing measurable health benefits that justified expensive professional intervention. As the physician carefully stores his prepared remedies in labeled containers while explaining their proper administration to anxious noble couples seeking professional assistance with their conjugal obligations, you begin to understand how medieval society medicalized intimate relationships through scientific frameworks that extended professional authority over the most private aspects of human experience while supporting religious mandates through medical evidence and therapeutic intervention. Tomorrow you'll discover how couples who failed to meet these medically supported obligations face serious consequences that could destroy their lives. But tonight, you rest knowing that medieval marriage existed at the intersection of spiritual duty, legal obligation, and medical necessity, requiring professional management by qualified authorities. You find yourself standing in the shadow of a pillory erected in the village square, where the morning sun casts long shadows across cobblestones still damp with dew, and the lingering traces of last night's shame. The wooden stalks stand empty now, but the iron rings embedded in the stone platform tell stories of public humiliation that awaited those who dared refuse their conjugal obligations in communities where intimate failure became public spectacle, designed to enforce compliance through social pressure that could destroy reputations, economic prospects, and family honor across generations of community memory. Here in these spaces where private behavior became public punishment, you discover how medieval society transformed conjugal refusal from personal choice into criminal offense, punishable by sanctions that ranged from financial penalties and public humiliation to complete social ostracism and ecclesiastical excommunication that could literally destroy lives in communities where religious conformity determined survival and social acceptance provided the only path to economic opportunity and family security. The court records you're examining document hundreds of cases where spouses face formal charges for failing to fulfill their marital duties, with detailed testimony from neighbors, servants, and family members who provided evidence about intimate compliance or refusal that transformed bedroom behavior into legal proceedings requiring witness testimony, professional arbitration, and formal judgments that could determine individual destinies according to institutional standards for appropriate conjugal behavior. Brother Marcus, the ecclesiastical clerk whose meticulous handwriting preserves these intimate legal proceedings, explains how conjugal refusal cases followed established judicial procedures that required formal complaints, witness testimony, and appeals processes that protected both accusers and accused while ensuring thorough investigation of allegations that could result in severe punishments, including public penance, financial penalties, temporary separation, or complete excommunication from Christian community. You observe how medieval courts distinguish between different categories of conjugal refusal, creating elaborate legal classifications that determined appropriate punishments based on the severity, duration, and circumstances surrounding intimate non-compliance, temporary refusal due to illness, recent childbirth, or religious obligations received lenient treatment, while persistent conjugal neglect or outright rebellion against marital duties triggered escalating sanctions designed to force compliance through increasingly severe social and economic pressure. The financial penalties you're discovering reveal how conjugal refusal affected family economics through fines, compensation payments, and legal costs that could bankrupt households already struggling with the economic pressures of medieval life, where survival depended on careful resource management and community cooperation that required maintaining good relationships with ecclesiastical authorities who controlled access to markets, legal protection, and social services. A merchant's wife who persistently refused her conjugal duties might face fines equivalent to several months' income, while her husband could be required to pay compensation to ecclesiastical authorities for the spiritual harm caused by their marriage's failure to fulfill its religious purposes according to church teachings that treated conjugal compliance as community obligation rather than private arrangement between individual spouses. Public penance ceremonies you're witnessing represent some of medieval society's most dramatic enforcement mechanisms, where conjugal offenders face ritualized humiliation designed to demonstrate the consequences of defying institutional authority, while providing community spectacle that reinforce social norms about appropriate marital behavior through collective participation in punishment proceedings that transformed individual failures into communal lessons. These ceremonies weren't spontaneous community responses, but carefully orchestrated religious theater that required extensive preparation, official approval, and formal documentation to ensure proper spiritual impact while maintaining ecclesiastical dignity that distinguished religious punishment from secular criminal proceedings. Offenders wore distinctive garments, carried symbolic objects, and performed prescribed actions that publicly acknowledged their failures while seeking divine forgiveness through community witness. The escalation procedures you're observing show how ecclesiastical authorities gradually increased pressure on non-compliant couples through progressive sanctions that began with private counseling, advanced to formal warnings, and culminated in public punishment that could include temporary excommunication, permanent banishment, or forced separation that dissolved marriages deemed irreparably damaged by persistent conjugal failure that threatened community moral standards. Regional variations in punishment reveal how different ecclesiastical jurisdictions adapted universal church teachings to local legal traditions, political relationships, and cultural customs that influenced appropriate responses to conjugal refusal. French ecclesiastical courts typically emphasize procedural safeguards and appeals processes that protected against arbitrary punishment, while English church authorities developed swifter enforcement mechanisms that prioritize rapid resolution of conjugal disputes that might otherwise destabilize community harmony. You discover how conjugal refusal cases intersected with broader medieval legal systems through appeals processes that could transfer cases between ecclesiastical and secular courts depending on the specific allegations, social status of the parties involved, and political relationships between religious and royal authorities who shared jurisdiction over marriage disputes with significant social or economic implications for community stability. The documentation requirements you're examining show how thoroughly medieval bureaucracy recorded conjugal punishment through official records that preserve detailed accounts of charges, testimony, judgments, and enforcement actions that created permanent archives of intimate failure that could affect future legal proceedings, marriage prospects for family members, and social standing within communities where reputation determined economic opportunity and political influence. Witness testimony reveals the extensive community surveillance that made conjugal enforcement possible through neighborhood networks that monitored intimate behavior with systematic attention that would challenge modern privacy expectations. Neighbors reported suspicious patterns in bedroom sounds. Servants testified about bedsheet conditions and sleeping arrangements, while family members provided testimony about conjugal compliance that could determine legal outcomes affecting entire households. The appeals procedures you're witnessing demonstrate how medieval legal systems balanced ecclesiastical authority with individual rights through formal processes that allowed accused spouses to contest charges, present counter-evidence, and seek modification of punishments that might seem excessive or inappropriate, given specific circumstances that required professional legal evaluation by qualified canonical lawyers who understood both religious law and practical applications. Female appellants you're observing reveal how women use legal systems to protect themselves from excessive conjugal demands, while challenging male authority within marriage relationships that officially subordinated wives to husbands, but provided legal recourse for women who faced unreasonable intimate obligations that exceeded ecclesiastical standards for appropriate marital behavior, according to canonical law that recognized mutual conjugal rights and responsibilities. The economic consequences of conjugal punishment extended far beyond immediate financial penalties to affect long-term family prosperity through social ostracism that limited business opportunities, marriage prospects for children, and access to community resources that required good standing with ecclesiastical authorities who controlled medieval social and economic life through religious institutions that provided essential services, including education, healthcare, and legal protection. Historians still argue whether these punishment systems represented legitimate enforcement of religious obligation or institutional abuse that enabled church authorities to exercise inappropriate control over private relationships through coercive mechanisms that violated individual autonomy while serving institutional interests in maintaining authority over the lay behavior that challenged clerical power and social hierarchy. Some scholars emphasize how conjugal enforcement protected vulnerable spouses from abandonment while maintaining family stability that served broader community interests in demographic maintenance and social order. Others highlight how the same systems enabled religious coercion that forced unwilling participation in intimate relationships while enriching ecclesiastical institutions through fines, fees, and donations that motivated clergy to pursue conjugal cases for financial rather than spiritual reasons. You sense how thoroughly conjugal punishment integrated intimate relationships into broader systems of social control, where personal behavior became public business, subject to institutional oversight that extended religious authority into the most private aspects of human experience while maintaining community compliance through fear of consequences that could destroy individual lives and family prosperity through social mechanisms that prioritize collective conformity over personal autonomy. As the morning sun climbs higher over the empty pillory where conjugal offenders once faced public humiliation for their intimate failures, you begin to understand how medieval society used punishment to enforce compliance with religious obligations that transformed marriage from private relationship into public institution, requiring community oversight and institutional management. Tomorrow you'll discover how these enforcement systems operated within the confessional spaces where private sins became public knowledge. But tonight, you rest knowing that medieval conjugal debt carried consequences that extended far beyond individual bedrooms to affect entire communities through systems of social control that made intimate behavior everyone's business. You kneel in the shadowed confessional booth of a parish church, where the scent of centuries-old wood mingles with burning tallow candles, and the whispered secrets of an entire community pass through the latticed screen that separates penitents from their priestly confessor. Here in this sacred space, where souls bear their most intimate failures before God's earthly representative, You discover how the sacrament of penance transformed conjugal debt from public legal obligation into private spiritual matter, requiring individual confession, personal accountability, and divine forgiveness that operated through ecclesiastical mediation between human failure and heavenly judgment. The wooden screen you're pressed against has heard thousands of conjugal confessions over decades of pastoral service, its dark grain absorbing the whispered admissions of intimate failure that transformed bedroom behavior into spiritual crisis requiring professional priestly intervention. Father Augustine, whose gentle voice has guided countless souls through their conjugal struggles, explains how confession provides the primary mechanism through which ordinary Christians acknowledge their failures to fulfill marital obligations while seeking divine mercy through ecclesiastical absolution. You listen as penitents describe their conjugal failures with careful euphemisms designed to convey spiritual guilt, while maintaining the dignity that confession requires when discussing intimate matters with celibate clergy who possess theological training but lack personal experience with marriage challenges that test even the most devout Christian's ability to fulfill their religious obligations consistently despite physical, emotional, and practical obstacles that interfere with daily compliance. The penances you're witnessing prescribed for conjugal failures reveal sophisticated theological reasoning about appropriate spiritual punishment for intimate sins that balance individual accountability with pastoral mercy, designed to encourage future compliance rather than discourage participation in the sacramental life that provided medieval Christians with their only legitimate path to salvation and spiritual peace within communities where religious conformity determined social acceptance and personal security. A peasant woman confesses 3 days of conjugal refusal during harvest season, when exhaustion made intimate compliance impossible despite her genuine desire to fulfill religious obligations, receiving penance requiring additional prayers and increased conjugal frequency during winter months when agricultural demands decreased and spiritual focus could properly address marital duties that required both physical capacity and emotional commitment to succeed according to ecclesiastical expectations. The seasonal confession patterns you're observing reveal how the conjugal failures clustered around agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and life events that created predictable stresses on intimate relationships requiring pastoral guidance to navigate successfully. Lenten confessions frequently included admissions of excessive conjugal activity during prohibited periods, while post-harvest confessions typically involved failures to resume proper intimate frequency after periods of agricultural labor that temporarily modified normal marital obligations. Regional confession practices created fascinating variations in how different parishes handled conjugal penance, reflecting local theological traditions, pastoral approaches, and community customs that influenced appropriate responses to intimate failures. Irish priests typically emphasized communal penance that involved public prayer and charitable works, while Italian confessors focused more heavily on private spiritual exercises designed to strengthen individual commitment to conjugal obligations. You discover how confessional guidance addressed the practical challenges that couples faced in fulfilling their conjugal obligations within the economic and social constraints of medieval life that made ideal compliance difficult despite genuine religious commitment. Priests provided advice about scheduling intimate obligations around work demands, managing health problems that interfered with conjugal capacity, and resolving marital conflicts that created emotional barriers to intimate compliance. The theological education you're witnessing, being provided during confession, reveals how priests served as intimate counselors who explained church teachings about conjugal debt while addressing individual circumstances that required modification of standard obligations. These weren't simply moral lectures, but sophisticated pastoral guidance that balanced religious requirements with practical reality in ways that supported both spiritual growth and marital stability. Confession manuals used by the medieval priests contain detailed instructions about appropriate questions to ask penitents regarding their conjugal behavior, creating systematic approaches to intimate spiritual guidance that ensured consistent pastoral care across different parishes while maintaining ecclesiastical authority over private relationships that required professional religious oversight to function properly according to divine intention. The absolution procedures you're observing demonstrate how confession transformed conjugal failure from permanent spiritual damage into temporary setback that could be resolved through proper penance and renewed commitment to marital obligations. This wasn't simply forgiveness, but spiritual rehabilitation that prepared penitents for future conjugal success through enhanced understanding of religious requirements and personal commitment to improving intimate compliance. Private confession created safe spaces where couples could admit conjugal struggles without facing the public humiliation that ecclesiastical courts imposed on serious offenders, providing alternative paths to spiritual reconciliation that encouraged voluntary compliance rather than forcing conformity through external pressure that might create resentment rather than genuine religious conversion. The spiritual direction you're witnessing provided during confession addresses deeper issues that affected conjugal relationships, including anger, resentment, fear, and the various emotional obstacles that interfered with intimate compliance despite couples' genuine desire to fulfill their religious obligations according to church teachings that required both physical performance and spiritual commitment to succeed fully. Confessional records maintained by some priests reveal patterns of conjugal failure that informed broader pastoral strategies for addressing community-wide problems with intimate compliance. These weren't legal documents, but spiritual notes that helped priests understand which teachings required additional emphasis and which couples needed ongoing pastoral support to maintain their marital obligations successfully. The intersection of confession with medical advice reveals how priests worked with physicians to address health problems that interfered with conjugal obligations, creating collaborative approaches that combine spiritual guidance with professional medical treatment designed to optimize intimate capacity while maintaining religious compliance according to both theological and scientific principles that supported marital success. Female penitents you're observing reveal how women used confession to seek guidance about conjugal obligations that conflicted with their health, safety, or family responsibilities, creating opportunities for pastoral advocacy that could modify unreasonable demands while maintaining ecclesiastical support for legitimate conjugal rights that protected women from abandonment or neglect within marriage relationships. The seasonal spiritual rhythms you're discovering show how confession integrated conjugal guidance into broader patterns of religious observance that connected intimate obligations with liturgical cycles, feast days, and spiritual seasons that provided natural frameworks for managing marital duties within the comprehensive religious calendar that structured medieval Christian life from birth to death. Historians still argue whether confessional involvement in conjugal behavior represented legitimate pastoral care or inappropriate clerical intrusion into private relationships that exceeded proper ecclesiastical authority, while serving institutional interests in maintaining control over lay sexuality that challenged traditional boundaries between religious and personal life within medieval Christian communities. Some scholars emphasize how confession provided essential spiritual support for couples struggling with conjugal obligations while offering alternatives to legal punishment that encourage voluntary compliance through pastoral guidance rather than coercive enforcement that might damage both individual souls and community harmony. Others highlight how confessional oversight extended clerical authority into intimate relationships through spiritual manipulation that used guilt and religious obligation to control private behavior. You sense how thoroughly confession integrated conjugal obligations into broader spiritual life, where intimate failures became opportunities for grace, spiritual growth, and enhanced understanding of religious duty that transformed marital difficulties into paths towards salvation, rather than simply personal problems requiring individual solution without institutional support or divine guidance. As you emerge from the confessional booth where candlelight flickers across centuries-old wood that has absorbed countless intimate secrets, you begin to understand how medieval Christianity used spiritual guidance to support conjugal compliance through pastoral care that balanced individual accountability with institutional mercy. Tomorrow you'll discover how these intimate obligations varied across different regions and social classes, But tonight you rest knowing that medieval marriage existed within comprehensive spiritual frameworks that provided both obligation and support for couples navigating the complex intersection of intimate relationship and religious duty. You find yourself wandering through the bustling marketplace of medieval Venice, where the salt-tinged air carries the mingled sounds of a dozen languages as merchants from across the known world negotiate deals beneath colorful awnings that flutter in the Mediterranean breeze. Here, among the spice stalls and silk vendors, you discover how regional variations in conjugal law created a fascinating patchwork of intimate obligations that differ dramatically between kingdoms, reflecting local customs, political relationships, and cultural traditions that modified universal church teachings according to practical necessities and diplomatic considerations. The Venetian marriage contracts you're examining reveal sophisticated legal frameworks that balanced ecclesiastical requirements with commercial necessities in a trading empire where merchant families formed international alliances through matrimonial arrangements that required flexible conjugal obligations, accommodating extended business travel, seasonal trade patterns, and the diplomatic relationships that sustained Mediterranean commerce across cultural and religious boundaries. Venetian law allowed for modified conjugal schedules when husbands departed on trading expeditions that could last months, creating legal frameworks that suspended daily obligations while requiring compensatory, intimate frequency upon return that ensured wives received their full conjugal rights despite the commercial necessities that separated merchant couples for extended periods. These arrangements required formal documentation, witness testimony, and ecclesiastical approval that protected both spouses while maintaining religious compliance. You drift northward across the Alps into the Germanic territories, where Emperor Frederick's court maintains different standards entirely, reflecting the complex political relationship between imperial authority and papal power that created unique ecclesiastical jurisdictions with modified conjugal requirements. German custom emphasized seasonal variations that aligned intimate obligations with agricultural cycles more closely than Mediterranean regions, creating legal frameworks that acknowledge the physical demands of Northern European farming. The imperial marriage laws you're studying show how secular authority intersected with ecclesiastical jurisdiction to create hybrid legal systems that balance religious requirements with political necessities. German nobles could petition imperial courts for modified conjugal obligations based on military service, diplomatic missions, or administrative duties that required extended absence from their wives, creating precedents that influenced conjugal law across the Holy Roman Empire. English common law presents entirely different approaches to conjugal debt, reflecting the kingdom's unique relationship with papal authority and the practical necessities of managing conjugal disputes across a realm where royal and ecclesiastical jurisdictions overlapped in complex ways. English ecclesiastical courts developed swifter enforcement mechanisms, but also more comprehensive appeals processes that protected against arbitrary punishment while ensuring efficient resolution of conjugal disputes. The English legal records you're examining document fascinating cases where wives successfully challenged excessive conjugal demands through ecclesiastical courts that recognize female rights within marriage relationships, establishing precedents that influence conjugal law development across other European jurisdictions. These cases reveal sophisticated legal reasoning about mutual conjugal obligations that challenge purely patriarchal interpretations of marital duty. French conjugal law emphasized elaborate procedural safeguards that reflected the kingdom's sophisticated administrative traditions inherited from Carolingian governmental systems. French ecclesiastical courts required extensive documentation, multiple witness testimony, and formal appeals processes that could extend conjugal cases for months while ensuring thorough investigation of all allegations before imposing penalties or ordering compliance modifications. The regional medical traditions you're discovering show how different European medical schools influence local approaches to conjugal health and appropriate intimate frequency. The famous medical school at Montpellier emphasized herbal remedies and dietary modifications, while physicians trained in Padua focused more heavily on anatomical considerations and surgical interventions that affected regional standards for conjugal capacity and reasonable intimate expectations. Spanish conjugal law reflected the unique cultural synthesis of Christian, Islamic, and Jewish legal traditions that created distinctive approaches to marital obligations. The influence of Islamic legal concepts about mutual conjugal rights and Jewish traditions regarding ritual purity created hybrid systems that balanced different religious requirements while maintaining Christian ecclesiastical authority over marriage regulation. Italian city-states developed the most elaborate conjugal legal systems, reflecting their sophisticated jurisprudential traditions inherited from Roman law and their political complexity as independent jurisdictions maintaining diplomatic relationships with both papal and imperial authority. Each major city-state, Florence, Milan, Genoa, created distinctive approaches to conjugal regulation that balanced local customs with universal church teachings. The trade networks you're following reveal how a conjugal law traveled across medieval Europe through commercial relationships, diplomatic correspondence, and ecclesiastical communication that shared legal precedents, enforcement techniques, and theological interpretations among authorities managing conjugal obligations across different cultural regions. Merchants, diplomats, and clergy carried legal knowledge that influenced conjugal development throughout Christian Europe. Scandinavian countries presented unique challenges for conjugal regulation due to their recent Christianization and persistent pagan traditions that influence attitudes toward marriage, sexuality, and religious authority. Northern European conjugal law often incorporated pre-Christian customs about seasonal marriage patterns, warrior-absent procedures, and the community roles that affected individual conjugal obligations. The climatic considerations you're discovering show how regional weather patterns influence conjugal law development in ways that modern historians often overlook. Northern European winters required extended cohabitation that increased intimate opportunities, while Mediterranean summers created health concerns that modified conjugal expectations during periods of extreme heat that could endanger both maternal and paternal health. Regional feast day calendars created additional variations in conjugal obligations as different saints' days, local celebrations, and seasonal observances required abstinence periods that varied significantly between regions. A couple's conjugal obligations might differ dramatically, depending on whether they lived in Ireland, with its extensive Celtic Christian calendar, or Spain with its distinctive blend of Christian and Reconquest celebrations. The linguistic differences you're encountering reveal how translation challenges affected conjugal law interpretation across regions where Latin ecclesiastical texts required vernacular explanation for populations who didn't understand classical language. These translation processes created opportunities for local modification that adapted universal church teachings to regional cultural expectations and practical necessities. Economic variations between regions influence conjugal law through different approaches to financial penalties, compensation procedures, and the economic consequences of conjugal failure that vary dramatically between wealthy trading regions and poor agricultural areas, where financial punishment carried different social implications for families operating at subsistence levels. Historians still argue whether regional variations in conjugal law represented legitimate adaptation to local conditions or dangerous deviation from universal church teachings that threatened ecclesiastical authority while serving local political interests that prioritized secular concerns over religious obligation and spiritual uniformity across Christian territories. The diplomatic relationships you're observing between different European kingdoms influence conjugal law development through marriage alliances that required compatible legal frameworks for noble couples whose unions served international political purposes. These diplomatic necessities created pressure for legal harmonization that balanced regional traditions with practical requirements for cross-border matrimonial arrangements. You sense how thoroughly regional variations in conjugal law reflected the broader political, cultural, and economic diversity of medieval Europe, where universal Christian teachings encountered local traditions, practical necessities, and political relationships that required constant negotiation between ecclesiastical authority and secular power individual rights and community obligations, religious ideal and practical reality. As you stand on London Bridge watching the Thames flow toward distant shores where different kingdoms maintain their own approaches to conjugal regulation, you begin to understand how medieval Europe's political fragmentation created legal diversity that challenged uniform ecclesiastical authority while serving local needs that required flexible adaptation of universal principles to regional circumstances that varied dramatically across the continent. Tomorrow you'll discover how these complex regional systems gradually evolved and eventually declined. But tonight you rest knowing that medieval conjugal debt was never truly universal, but always adapted to local conditions that reflected the rich diversity of European Christian civilization, despite its claims to unified religious authority over intimate human relationships. You step into the golden light of an early Renaissance morning, where cathedral bells ring with different rhythms than they did centuries before, and the air carries whispers of change that will transform everything you've discovered about medieval conjugal obligations. Here, in these final moments of an era that regulated bedroom behavior with theological precision, you witness the gradual dissolution of systems that once made intimate compliance a matter of eternal salvation and temporal survival. The printing presses you're observing in minds represent more than technological innovation. They're engines of transformation that will democratize knowledge, challenge ecclesiastical authority, and ultimately undermine the very foundations of conjugal debt by making religious texts available to ordinary people who can read divine commandments without clerical interpretation. Johannes Gutenberg's movable type doesn't just reproduce books. It reproduces ideas that will question institutional authority over private relationships. You watch as Martin Luther's theological revolution spreads across Northern Europe, like wildfire consuming centuries of canonical tradition. His radical concept of marriage as companionate relationship rather than legal contract strikes at the heart of conjugal debt theory, replacing daily obligations with mutual affection and personal choice that transforms intimate relationships from institutional business into private matters between consenting adults who negotiate their own boundaries. The Protestant Reformation you're witnessing doesn't simply challenge papal authority. It fundamentally reimagines marriage as spiritual partnership rather than regulated obligation, dissolving the legal frameworks that once made conjugal refusal a punishable offense. Lutheran and Calvinist theologians developed new approaches to marital sexuality that emphasize mutual consent, emotional compatibility, and personal responsibility rather than institutional enforcement of daily intimate quotas. Renaissance humanism contributes to conjugal debt's decline through philosophical frameworks that prioritize individual autonomy, personal dignity, and rational choice over institutional authority and traditional obligation. Humanist scholars question whether religious institutions should regulate private relationships, introducing concepts of personal liberty that challenge medieval assumptions about legitimate ecclesiastical oversight of intimate behavior. The rise of centralized royal authority gradually undermines ecclesiastical jurisdiction over marriage disputes as secular courts claim expanded authority over domestic relationships that affect inheritance, property, and political alliances. Royal legal systems develop more efficient approaches to marriage regulation that prioritize political stability over religious compliance, reducing conjugal debt to private spiritual matter rather than public legal obligation. Economic transformations accompanying the transition from feudalism to early capitalism create new social relationships that make medieval marriage patterns increasingly obsolete. Urban merchant families develop different approaches to intimate relationships that emphasize companionship, mutual support, and economic partnership rather than reproductive duty and religious compliance measured through daily performance quotas. The scientific revolution challenges medical theories that once supported conjugal debt through humoral theory and astrological calculation. New anatomical knowledge, improved understanding of human reproduction, and rational approaches to healthcare undermine the medical justifications that physicians once provided for daily intimate obligations supposedly required for physical and spiritual well-being. Cultural changes accompanying Renaissance artistic and literary development create new romantic ideals that emphasize emotional connection, personal choice, and individual fulfillment over institutional obligation and community pressure. Romantic literature, courtly poetry, and artistic representations of love begin celebrating personal desire rather than religious duty as the proper foundation for intimate relationships. The exploration of new worlds beyond Europe introduces different cultural approaches to marriage, sexuality, and intimate relationships that challenge European assumptions about universal natural law and divine commandment. Contact with indigenous American, African, and Asian societies reveals alternative models for organizing family life that function successfully without ecclesiastical regulation of conjugal frequency. Intellectual developments in universities gradually shift academic attention away from canonical law toward natural philosophy, experimental science, and rational inquiry that questions traditional authorities and institutional claims to regulate private behavior. University-educated professionals develop new approaches to social organization that emphasize reason, evidence, and practical effectiveness over traditional religious authority. The Counter-Reformation represents the Catholic Church's attempt to maintain relevance in a changing world, but even Reformed Catholicism moves away from the detailed regulation of conjugal behavior that characterized medieval practice. Tridentine reforms emphasize spiritual education, personal devotion, and pastoral care rather than legal enforcement of intimate obligations through ecclesiastical courts and community surveillance. Wars of religion across 16th and 17th century Europe exhaust both Catholic and Protestant resources while demonstrating the destructive consequences of religious authority extended into political and personal spheres. These conflicts create practical pressure for religious tolerance and reduced ecclesiastical involvement in secular affairs, including marriage regulation. The development of international trade networks creates cosmopolitan urban environments where different cultural approaches to marriage and sexuality interact, compete, and synthesize into new models that emphasize individual choice and cultural adaptation rather than universal religious obligation enforced through institutional authority and community pressure. Enlightenment philosophy completing this transformation introduces systematic criticism of traditional authority, institutional coercion, and religious regulation of private behavior. Enlightenment thinkers develop comprehensive theories of natural rights, individual liberty, and rational choice that make medieval conjugal debt seem primitive superstition rather than legitimate spiritual discipline. Scientific approaches to human psychology and sexuality gradually replace theological frameworks for understanding intimate relationships, shifting attention from religious obligation toward emotional health, personal compatibility, and mutual satisfaction as appropriate goals for married couples seeking happiness rather than salvation through institutional compliance. Legal developments toward the modern family law emphasize mutual consent, individual rights, and practical dispute resolution rather than religious compliance and institutional authority over private relationships. Modern marriage law treats intimate relationships as private contracts between consenting adults rather than public obligations requiring community oversight and ecclesiastical regulation. The transformation you're witnessing isn't sudden collapse, but gradual evolution, as medieval systems prove increasingly incompatible with social, economic, and intellectual changes that create new approaches to human relationships based on individual choice rather than institutional authority, mutual affection rather than legal obligation, and personal happiness rather than community conformity. By the 18th century, conjugal debt survives primarily as historical curiosity studied by scholars interested in medieval legal systems, rather than living practice that shapes contemporary intimate relationships. The daily requirements that once determined individual salvation and social acceptance become footnotes in academic treatises about obsolete canonical law that seems almost incomprehensible to modern audiences. Yet traces of medieval conjugal debt persist in modern legal concepts about marital rights, spousal support, and the continuing tension between individual autonomy and institutional authority over private relationships. contemporary debates about marriage equality, reproductive rights, and family law echo ancient arguments about legitimate institutional authority over intimate human relationships. The psychological legacy continues through cultural expectations about appropriate intimate frequency, gender roles within marriage, and the persistent sense that sexual relationships carry the moral implications requiring social approval and institutional recognition. Modern couples may not face ecclesiastical courts, but they still navigate social pressure about appropriate intimate behavior. As dawn breaks over a world where individual choice has largely replaced institutional obligation in intimate relationships, you understand that medieval conjugal debt represented one historical approach to organizing human sexuality that served specific social functions while creating systems of control that modern society has largely abandoned in favor of personal autonomy and mutual consent. The daily requirements that once brought couples before bishops' courts now seem like curious relics from an age when religious authority claimed jurisdiction over every aspect of human experience, yet they remind us how thoroughly institutions can shape the most private aspects of human relationships when individuals lack effective means to resist collective pressure. Tonight's journey through medieval conjugal debt reveals both the power of institutional authority to regulate private behavior and the ultimate triumph of individual choice over collective obligation in intimate relationships that modern society treats as private matters, requiring personal negotiation rather than professional oversight by religious or secular authorities claiming expertise in bedroom management. The candlelight in Canterbury Cathedral grows softer now, as if the ancient stones themselves are settling into peaceful slumber after witnessing centuries of human struggle between desire and duty, private longing and public obligation. You drift away from those leather-bound volumes, their pages no longer crackling with legal urgency, but whispering with the gentle understanding that comes when distant history finally makes sense. The medieval world you've explored tonight feels both impossibly foreign and strangely familiar. Those bishops counting conjugal days on ecclesiastical calendars, those peasant couples negotiating intimate obligations around harvest schedules, those nobles whose bedroom behavior determined dynastic survival. They weren't so different from modern people trying to balance personal desire with social expectation, individual happiness with institutional demands. Perhaps the daily requirement seems absurd to your contemporary sensibilities, but you've discovered how thoroughly it served medieval society's needs for demographic stability, social order, and spiritual discipline in communities where survival depended on collective cooperation and shared adherence to authority that had governed every aspect of human experience from birth to death. The conjugal debt wasn't simply patriarchal oppression or religious obsession with sexuality, though it certainly contained elements of both. It was medieval civilization's attempt to organize one of humanity's most powerful and unpredictable forces, sexual desire, into systems that served broader social purposes while providing frameworks for individual behavior that might otherwise threaten community stability and spiritual welfare. As your breathing slows and your mind settles into the peaceful rhythm of approaching sleep, let the complexity of medieval conjugal debt remind you that human relationships have always required negotiation between individual desire and collective need, personal autonomy and social obligation, private fulfillment and institutional authority that claims to understand what's best for both individuals and communities. The medieval experiment with daily conjugal requirements ultimately failed because it tried to regulate the unregulatable, measure the unmeasurable, and institutionalize the essentially personal. Yet it succeeded in creating stable family structures, clear social expectations, and comprehensive support systems that helped ordinary people navigate the challenges of intimate relationships within broader frameworks of meaning and purpose. Tonight you've learned that love and law, passion and politics, individual desire and institutional authority have always danced together in complex rhythms that changes with time but never entirely disappear. Medieval conjugal debt may seem like ancient history, but its echoes continue in contemporary debates about marriage, sexuality, and the proper balance between personal freedom and social responsibility. Rest now in the knowledge that human relationships have always been both deeply personal and thoroughly social, simultaneously private and public, individual and institutional. The medieval solution to this eternal tension may no longer serve our needs, but the underlying challenge remains. How do we balance personal happiness with collective welfare, individual choice with social stability, private desire with public good? Sleep well, knowing that the questions medieval people faced about love, marriage, and intimate obligation continue to shape human experience in ways both obvious and subtle, ancient and eternal, personal and universal. Sweet dreams.